I'd now like to introduce our guest for today's show. We'll be interviewing Laura Janusik, PhD, MBA, CLP, and CEO of Listening to Change. A recent survey indicated that 70% of people think they're above average listeners and believe those around them are below average. If you know anything about math, you know that can't possibly be true. So how can you know if you're really a good listener? Well, Laura Janusik, hashtag Dr. J Listen, can help you find out. Laura is leveraging her past experience, which includes 15 years of corporate experience, 20 years as a professor and researcher of listening, to help coaches, salespeople, and business leaders develop better relationships through the power of listening. Laura is known throughout the world as a leading expert in teaching and training listening. Her PhD in communications and her MBA assist her in using research-based information to help people become better listeners and gain the results they desire, whether that be better relationships, increased sales, improved coaching conversations, or more trust, just to name a few. Her research and ideas have been published nationally and internationally and cited in publications including Forbes, Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and US News and World Report. I'm really excited to have our special guest on today's show. Thank you very much for being here with us today, Laura.
Thanks, Michael. Very excited to be here as well.
Oh, absolutely. I know that all coaches agree that listening is a core part of a coaching conversation. And while we are probably in that 70% that feel like we're above average listeners, I think some of us could probably use a tip or two on how to improve our listening skills. So we're keenly listening to today's interview to see how we can improve, Laura. So I'd like to start by asking my first question. Listening is important in all conversations. But what about the coaching conversation? How does listening play a crucial role in the coaching conversation?
It's a great question. And as you well know, and most coaches know, you get your job done primarily through two skills: asking great questions and listening. And if you are weak in either of those two skills, you're not going to become a great coach. As you move up the scale in coaching and get more certifications, listening takes on different meaning, what you can do with it, what it is. What I always ask coaches to do is think about the first time they went to a coaching class. And people will say, well, they said listening is important, listening is important. And I thought, well, what's the big deal? I've been listening since I've been born. But once you learn different ways to listen in coaching, you recognize that it's much more challenging than what you've been doing since you've been born. And there are lots of other ways to do it as well. So even though coaches get more training than most people, they only get the tip of the iceberg in the training.
You seem to be keenly interested in helping coaches improve their listening skills, because I know that you actually offer courses specifically for coaches. Why this particular interest in the coaching conversation?
I love coaches. I have this over 20 years of experience in researching listening and training listening and trying to improve my listening. And I like that listening ends in ing because it means it's always present. I am never going to become an expert listener. Every day I get to practice my listening and I get to become better in listening. And I understand how listening contributes to qualities of relationships. The quality of listening determines the quality of the relationship. And once you understand this, you approach your listening differently, which means that your relationships change. So when I got out of academia and I wanted to use my background in listening to help people, because I'm a helper, right? You can't be an educator for well over 20 years and not be a helper. I am definitely a helper. I thought, well, I could become a coach myself. But if I can help a number of coaches and they help numbers of people, I can indirectly help so many more people by working directly with coaches. So that's why I'm so excited about working with coaches. They already understand that listening is important, and they're eager to do it better because it makes them a better coach.
That's so true.
Mhm.
Coaches inherently know they need to be great listeners and do what they do. Beyond that awareness, what do you think coaches need to know about the value of listening?
I'm not sure that it would be the value of listening. I'm not sure that that's the exact word that I would use,
Mhm.
but understanding that what you learn in coach training, though, is very good, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more to know about listening, because listening actually has been researched through a number of different perspectives. I come from the communication perspective, but I'm very well versed in the psychological perspectives of listening, the helping perspectives of listening, the spiritual perspectives of listening. And so once you recognize that listening is a lot of things, as opposed to this one thing that you learned in coach training, you recognize that you can do it differently and better, more skillfully.
What are a few quick tips that you would give to a coach who wants to improve their listening skills right away?
One of the quick tips, and I know you know how important this is, it's this idea of holding space.
Mm.
And I oftentimes have coaches, particularly the beginning coaches going for their ACCs, getting their first 100 hours. They're like, how do I keep my mouth shut? Right? Because they want to help. And most of us are so conditioned to think of helping as telling them what the answer is.
Mhm.
But in coaching, of course, it's pulling the answers out of them or giving them the time and space to identify their own answers. So I think the first thing is this idea of holding space. And one of the ways to become much more comfortable with it is that 3-second pause. There's a reason that it's 3 seconds. Because the coach or the research suggests that, particularly in the United States, we tend to respond to the other in about a half a second. So once you quit talking, I will respond within a half a second. And that's shorter than I need to really figure out what I'm thinking. And so we also know through research that about 3 seconds is where people start getting uncomfortable. So when people get uncomfortable, what do? They start talking. So if you as the coach can learn to hold space for at least 3 seconds, I recommend biting your thumb or doing another physical action to yourself so you know what you're doing, then chances are the other person is going to break the silence and give you more information and help figure it out for themselves. So I would say that that's the first tip that I have for coaches. Second tip is, what do you do after you learn to hold space? So now what do you do with the silence? And that's really starting to listen to the nonverbals and to feel what's going on in the room. And then bring that into some of those quality questions that you ask. So the third thing is to understand that people process information differently, which means we listen differently. We preference some information over others. And
Mhm.
so that's called listening filters or listening dominances. And this is some of the most recent research that was published back in 2012. So if you understand what those listening filters are, you can better assist your client by learning to speak their language. So the questions, the way that you phrase the questions actually resonate with them more, which will help the transformation be faster. The fourth thing would be to create this foundation or expectation, I should say, in your coaching meetings where you actually set the expectation of silence. I'm going to ask you some questions that you probably don't know the answer to right off the top of your head. And that's absolutely fine. Take as much time as you need before you respond. The silence is absolutely expected and good because it helps you think.
You mentioned that after 3 seconds, people start to get uncomfortable. And I like that idea because we do seek to make people uncomfortable in coaching conversations. If we remain comfortable the whole time, we may not break through to a new insight, an awareness, a discovery, if we remain in our comfort zone. So I like the idea of using that 3-second pause as one way to help our clients get a little uncomfortable. Coaches love to read books. If there's a group that loves to read books, and I listen to a lot of books myself, but it's coaches. Are there any books that you'd recommend to help a coach improve their listening skills?
Yeah, there actually are. I really believe in listening-backed research, right? So the listening that we do in a coaching situation should be supported through the research on listening. And so one of the mass market books that's out there that I think is really good in giving a broad overview to listening, but also some very great listening specifics, is called I Think You're Not Listening. You're Not Listening by Kate Murphy. And she actually researched a number of different people and really recounted their stories of research in that book. So I particularly like that book because of the research focus. In terms of specifically within a coaching context, I really like the work of Nancy Klein. I read her first book, Time to Think. Oh gosh, it's probably going on over 20 years ago. Maybe it wasn't quite 20 years ago, but something along those lines. And she's written at least 3 more books. Her latest one is about the promise of not interrupting. And so I really like her books because she's a coach, and now she has her own coaching institute too, where she trains people to allow others to have that time to think. And then as you and I had discussed before this call, we both like to listen to things as well. So I think the podcast by Oscar Trimboli called Deep Listening, I think that he interviews some amazing people, not coaching specific per se, but it really helps coaches, any individual actually, to understand how listening is used in so many different types of professions. And it's a great way to borrow great ideas from other professions.
That sounds really interesting, actually. Thank you for those recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've often thought of listening as a skill, but I've heard you say in some of our conversations and by watching some of your videos that listening is a behavior. Can you delve into that just a little bit for us, Laura,
Yeah.
and explain? I think you know where I'm going with that.
I do. I don't like to think of a listening skill because oftentimes people think of a skill as being analogous to a tool. So for example, a set of pliers or a hammer. And you can use different tools in different situations and they will work. They just won't work as effectively. So I like to think of listening as a strategy. So you figure out what you want from it. So what's your end goal here? And then you use the listening skills that are most appropriate to meet your end goal. But listening is also a behavior because listening isn't just about just sitting here quietly. It's about strategically what you're doing in your brain, how you're responding with your body, and how you're going to respond with your words. So listening really is composed in all of those areas. So listening is really a behavior. And if I wanted to go one step further on that, this is something that surprises coaches all the time. There's absolutely no research around the world that any listening behavior ties to what's going on in the brain. So we often learn that active listening is really important in terms of eye contact and head nodding and things like that. But that doesn't mean the person is listening. the person is using the nonverbal behaviors that show respect of a good listener, but they might not have anything going on cognitively. And that's ultimately where we listen. That's why listening is a verbal behavior, because when you respond to someone, then you can really understand how they listen to you or how you listen to them. I know that's heavy.
So it seems to me that it's not something that you apply or turn on as more of a way of being.
It's a way of being, but it's also something that you turn on. One of the things when I work with coaches, I say, do you listen to your spouse or your partner or your children the same way that you listen in a coaching session? And 100% of the time they're like, no, I don't have as much patience with them. I don't allow them to figure it out. So depending upon the context that you're using the listening in, you are going to turn on different attributes of it. And I think coaching is a great example, because you're thinking about that strategic end game of a coaching session, which is allowing the client to figure it out, right? So you're always asking questions and then keeping silent to allow them to do that.
What else would you recommend that a coach should do to go deeper towards becoming a great listener?
I love working with coaches, and the resistance that I find with coaches really is because their eyes were so open to listening when they took their coach training. They think they know what listening is, and they know what listening is much more than the rest of the population. I certainly concede that. But what they don't recognize is that coaching comes from so many different disciplines. So, or listening comes out of so many different disciplines. So we look at and study listening in communication, in spirituality, in the helping professions, in psychology, in neuroscience. So a lot of the coaches are using NLP. So there's so much more to know about listening and how the brain operates and how the brain takes in information and operates. And so understanding how that works is really important for a coaching situation, because it can help the coach strategically figure out which way to move within it.
When someone has studied the art of listening and sought to apply what they've learned, how will they know when they've truly become a better listener?
I love this question. That's a great question. First of all, I will say other people will tell you. You know, because other people tell you that you're a really good listener. What if people aren't telling you that? Then I would challenge your listening coaches to do this. Go to 3 people in their lives and say 3 questions. What do I do well as a listener? What don't I do well as a listener? And what should I do to listen better? And whenever I have people do this as an intercession assignment, they come back really surprised, because they don't realize what other people are picking up about them as a listener.
My guess is that very few coaches have ever asked those questions. And my understanding, Laura, from other conversations with you, is that only 2% of the general population have ever actually taken a listening training, not heard about listening as part of a generalized training program, because of course we talk about listening in coaching, but just listening training, only about 2% of the population. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. And coaches do get some education in listening, so that makes them part of that 2%, which automatically makes them better listeners than the average person. But there's so much more to know and apply. It's not just the knowing it, but it's the using it.
Right, very much so. And coaches have the opportunity to apply almost daily what they're learning about listening improvement. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our viewers? A question that I may not have asked. In coaching, we often sometimes say, what's a question I should have asked you that I didn't ask?
I'd encourage coaches to think about listening within a context. So, for example, some of the classes that I've taught in the past look at listening within a context. The perfect example is different cultures have different nonverbal behaviors that indicate listening. So if you're working with clients from different cultures, it's really important to understand some of those norms, because if you don't, you are going to make incorrect assumptions. For example, there are a number of cultures, and I say a number. Initially, I thought it was 2, but it's actually at least 5, where this means no and this means yes. And imagine speaking to someone from that culture, because you would be walking away with the exact opposite meaning of what they were trying to tell you. How long we take to respond, that's called turn taking. That's something that's different in cultures as well. Another area that I like to talk about is listening and empathy. And research actually supports that there are 3 very specific listening behaviors that you can do to demonstrate empathy. So if you want to be perceived to be more empathetic by your clients, you would want to know what those 3 behaviors are, and you would want to start using it. So I think once we start looking at contextualizing listening for what you want it to use it for strategically, then there's so much more to learn out there.
That was a terrific response to what should I have asked you, Laura. So thank you very much for answering that question and for all of the wonderful information that you shared with us. For coaches who would like to go deeper, and that should be just about every one of you, I will have a link in the comments where you can learn more about Dr. Laura, her courses, and also her coaching, because she also coaches people on how to improve their listening too. So you could take courses and then you could work one-on-one to learn how to apply many of these ideas to your coaching. So thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Michael. I enjoyed it a lot.
Me too.